Okay, good morning or good afternoon or good evening, everyone. We're not sure who's listening at the moment, but we're happy that everybody's here joining our session on exploring the interplay of pragmatism and idealism, insights from projects on carbon removals. We are here. The session has been organized by 4 of us who are here from the University of Waterloo. Vanessa Schweitzer is here, and Stephanie. Sorry, Stephanie, can't see you right now. Are you still there?
Yep. Yeah.
Okay, sorry. All right, that was my screen. Stephanie Kortinovis is here, and then also Elisabeth Dütschke and myself from the Fraunhofer Institute for System and Innovation Research. So it's kind of a Canadian-German collaboration for the session. And we're also happy to have a lot of our speakers here joining also from Canada, Germany, the US, I believe, and Italy. So thank you all for being here. Why are we doing this session, or kind of what are we looking for in this session is we were thinking about carbon removal strategies in a very broad sense. So kind of from the more natural settings of, for example, afforestation or reforestation, carbon farming, to more kind of technical driven solutions, BECCS, DACs, carbon capture storage solutions, as well as potentially enhanced mineralization. So very broad kind of carbon removal strategies that we might have potentially for addressing issues of climate change in a very potentially also idealistic, not in a negative idealistic, but in kind of an idealistic way of kind of what this might do to kind of help us address these issues, but then also potentially kind of clashing sometimes or kind of causing challenges with pragmatic considerations, with kind of projects on the ground, kind of different stakeholders being involved, kind of considering what this might do. So we were wondering in terms of potentially objectives, governance frameworks, and also just transition considerations, what kind of these aspirations of carbon removal strategies kind of do when we think about kind of long-term effects, particularly also, for example, in kind of the context of considering SDGs, so Sustainable Development Goals. So if we think about this, for example, the objectives, we often have the objectives of emission mitigation, but then the question arises, okay, for which industries? Are we talking about hard to abate industries? Are we talking with these solutions also other kind of industry, other sectors that kind of might address this objective, often also potentially further economic development, but kind of questions of sustainability, kind of going back also to the SDGs, kind of arising here, both maybe in an ecological sense, but also potentially in an economic sense, kind of the discussion about potentially green growth, question mark, is that even something that kind of we can think about in this context arise, governance frameworks, kind of, but also who governs in these government framework, what is governed in these governance frameworks. All of this kind of are questions that we think are worth discussing in this context, but then also kind of this question of how does this help us potentially for kind of achieving just transitions out of carbon locked systems for the more than human world, so for kind of environment, ecosystems, animals, but also kind of impact, potential social, political, and also economic impacts on the human world. So kind of we want to talk today about kind of looking at specific projects, but then also kind of talking about these issues from various perspectives, kind of that kind of form at their core kind of power and narratives around carbon removal strategies and how they can interact with different goals that actors set and that also have different impacts depending on what we're looking at. So the way our session today is structured is that we will have 3 presentations by 3 of our panelist speakers, and then also kind of responses to these kind of presentations and to the general topic from 3 discussants. So our 3 presenters today are Sven Alzheimer, Stephanie Corinovis, Hope Elizabeth Tracy, and then also Selina Scott Büchler. And then the discussion is going to be started by Professor Will Burns, followed by Dr. Lisa Guasti, and then also Dr. Elizabeth Dütschke. And then Professor Vanessa Schweitzer towards the end will kind of moderate and kind of take over our discussion section. And for this, kind of just some quick housekeeping. So at the moment, you as the attendees are not able to kind of raise your hands or kind of post questions in the chat, but you can post questions throughout the presentations in the Q&A box that kind of is available to you. And then also towards the end of the session, after all the presentations, we invite all of you to also kind of become speakers and panelists so we can interact more directly with one another. That said, without further ado, I would invite Sven Alzheimer to start with our first presentation.
Yeah, thanks, Anne, for this introduction. I hope you can see my screen. Please give me a heads up if you don't. Otherwise, I will start. Okay, seems like everything works. Perfect. Yeah, thanks for having me. So I'm going to talk about the acceptance of CCUS at regional and national level. So my name is Sven Alzheimer. I'm from Fraunhofer ISI, so the same institute in Germany that Anne and Elisabeth are from. And as I said, this presentation will be on CCUS acceptance at regional and national levels. And what I'm going to focus on specifically is this moving from theory to practice when it comes to CCUS deployment. So carbon capture, CCUS refers to carbon capture, utilization, and storage. And this technology is considered to be an important contribution to climate change mitigation. A lot of hard-to-abate industries are turning to CCS as they lack cost-efficient alternatives for CO2 abatement. And when we just look at it from a techno-economic perspective, and if we take into account the climate objectives that we have, the case for CCS seems relatively clear theoretically. Accordingly, CCS is also high on the political agenda of many governments. There are ambitious targets for its implementation. However, there are, and this is similar to CDR technologies, so carbon direct removal technologies, CCUS, when it comes to its implementation, faces a number of barriers. And many of these also relate to the aspect of CO2 storage, which is also something where it shares similarities to many CDR technologies. And these challenges, they also stem from the fact that the policy framework around the technology is still evolving, the fact that institutions like, so the rules, norms, or values of society, they are newly emerging or changing, and all of that leads to open questions of legitimacy and public support for the technology when it comes to real-world implementation. So thinking about or talking about CCUS and its deployment is nothing new. About a decade ago, in this regard, it was CCS was discussed in various arenas already. However, the interest in this technology waned in the time after due to the fact that renewable energy sources were more easily available, projects faced local opposition, and policymakers were slow to adapt the policy framework to the developments of the technology. And now that we have a current situation where we have an increasing political and industrial interest in the topic again, this study tries to assess the current levels of public perception and acceptance towards CCUS and to assess the level of support for its implementation. in this study, we draw on research from the field of social acceptance of technologies. We wanted to examine factors that influence the perceptions of individuals towards CCUS. And we wanted to generate an understanding, in order to generate an understanding of society's readiness for its implementation, while contrasting acceptance at regional and national levels. So this was our aim. Our research is part of a bigger project, so the Hercules project. Here you can see a slide with a brief overview over the project. I don't want to go into detail here, just want to point out that this project aims at or looks at the application of CCS in Southern Europe, specifically 2 full-scale CCUS chains in a region in Greece and a region in northern Italy. If you want to have further information on this project, feel free to reach out or visit our website. In this presentation here, as part of the Hercules project, there were some, there's also research on technological developments and the economic side, but also and this is something that we are looking at, the societal readiness for its implementation and social political acceptance of it. And this is something where we focus on, and also the kind of research that we looked into while preparing our study. So when we looked at previous research on this, we saw that previous studies on the acceptance of CCS, they found that the public awareness of CCS technologies is rather low in European countries. Awareness is a bit higher in those countries that are more, where CCS is more developed in contrast to the others. But in general, it's rather low. Also, we have some indications from previous studies that the current perceptions towards CCS might not yet be stable. There are ongoing public debates on this topic, and these might shape what society thinks about it. And what we also see is that acceptance at societal levels and at local levels, they might be different. So while at national or societal level, we see that newer studies find more favorable levels of acceptance, at a local level, these findings were more mixed. We also see some factors which are reported to be, or which are found to be associated with the acceptance of the technology implementation. But little prior research has so far studied the countries of interest in our study, so Greece and Italy, and none the same regions. As I said, our study is part of the Hercules project, and as part of this project, we did survey studies to identify the levels of acceptance for CCS deployment in Italy and Greece, or specifically in 2 regions, in one region in Italy and one region in Greece. And also we wanted to identify factors that are associated with the acceptance levels of the respondents. And we had 4 samples for this. So we surveyed respondents in Greece on a national level, in Italy on a national level, and then we had 1 sample in a region in Greece and 1 in a region in Italy. And so these 4 samples were used. We tried to be representative. We had the questionnaires in the national languages, and we wanted to enable the respondents to make informed assessments. And to this end, we provided them with basic information on the technology, so on CCUS, and also the project activities. We showed them the figure that you can see on the right-hand side, and we clarified the focus of the project is on the storage of CO2. What we found is that, as expected, the levels of familiarity in the regions and also on national level with CCS technology were rather low. We also saw that the respondents evaluated the technology CCS as a technological option to mitigate CO2 emissions, rather mixed. But then when we looked at how they whether they accepted a potential local implementation of CCS in the study areas in Greece and in Italy, we actually saw that acceptance levels were quite high. So this you can see on the right-hand side. Blue indicates acceptable, that they regarded it as rather acceptable or acceptable. And we see that in 3 of the samples, the levels of acceptance were rather comparable, but we also see differences, as we see that in Eastern Macedonian phrase, the responses were least favorable. And in order to identify why these differences might occur, or why some individuals might be more accepting than others, we did a statistical analysis, so regression analysis, to identify factors that are associated with the acceptance of a potential implementation of CCS. And what we found is that the acceptance of the implementation is strongly related to individuals' perceptions of not only the technology, so it's related with the perceived environmental impacts and whether they found it to be them to be more negative, but it's not only related to their perceptions of the technology only, it's also related to their perceptions of the implementation process, so whether they found or expected the decisions about the implementation to be fair, and also their perceptions about the actors involved were also relevant as well. Here, trust in industry actors was something that we found to be very relevant for their acceptance evaluations and whether they are more in favor or less in favor of the implementation of CCS. This all highlights that when we look at CCS implementation and we want to go from theory to practice in this regard, that even though CCS is high on the political agenda, and even though acceptance levels in Greece and Italy are quite high, there's still some uncertainties left. So the policy framework is still evolving, public familiarity is low, also the acceptance levels that we assessed with regard to proposed or early stage projects. And all of this indicates that the perception on these topics are still volatile. And what we tried to contribute to with our study is we wanted to provide insights into the factors that were influential for acceptance of implementing CCS at the local level. And also we have some indications for some of the contextual conditions that are relevant as well if we look at acceptance at the local level, as we saw some similarities between national and local levels, so that we saw that broader discussions might be affecting the local implementation as well. And also we saw some structural differences that matter between the different regions studied. And this all implies that greater attention should be put on the local contexts in research, but also in practice. And this is something that we also will do or are doing in the HECLOS project, as we in further in-depth analyses, we want to combine the survey findings with also analyses of regional profiles, where we look into the regional context, and also we engage with stakeholders and citizens in the regions. And to conclude, just want to also point out that, as I said, the local context matters, but it also shares similarities with overall developments. So to consider these similarities and the interdependencies between local and national level is also relevant in this regard. With this, I'm concluding my presentation. Thanks for your attention. If you have any questions, feel free to ask.
Thank you, Sven. Yes, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A tab and we will kind of come back to them later. So then with this, I would invite Stephanie and Hope to continue their presentation.
Yeah, just getting set up here. Okay, I'm going to assume everybody can see the slides now.
Yes.
So hi, everybody. Hope and I today will be presenting on marine carbon dioxide removal, or MCDR, navigating the regulatory, scientific, and social realities. I'm Stephanie Rose-Kortenovis. I am a PhD student. Actually, Hope and I, rather, are both PhD students at the Balsillie School of International Affairs out of the University of Waterloo in global governance. And we're also both a part of the Waterloo Climate Intervention Strategies Lab, or WATCISL. So today I'll start by giving a short introduction on what MCDR is. We will primarily be looking at technology-based means of MCDR in this presentation. However, the lines that can be drawn between technology and nature-based options can get a little bit blurry, depending on the context and scale of a project. Therefore, here I'm broadly defining technology, so it's inclusive of both physical interventions and installations, as well as management practices. As an example of an MCDR technique, ocean alkalinity enhancement is one of the most popular and developed techniques at the moment, which involves adding minerals to seawater to enhance the ocean's natural capacity to absorb carbon as a sink. Some other methods also involve depositing substances, while other proposed ideas involve building ocean-based facilities to filter carbon directly from the water, move water around, all with the goal of allowing the marine environment to continue to indirectly sink atmospheric carbon. There are a number of different technological and governance questions at play, including where to locate projects and whether co-benefits to ocean ecosystems are possible with such techniques, and whether these kinds of depositions are or ought to be considered ocean pollution. The question of co-benefits in particular factors into questions of why we'd risk doing MCDR compared to more advanced terrestrial CDR or nature-based sequestration options. To call in the earlier example of ocean alkalinity enhancement, for example, that might be used to reduce ocean acidification. To be clear, though, we're operating on the assumption that we will need hundreds of gigatons of CDR and storage to meet our climate goals at 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius, because our natural sinks are finite and mitigation has been much too slow. So one recent development is that the International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea released an advisory opinion that determines CO2 ought to be treated as a marine pollutant, which entails specific state duties under international law. This means that if a particular method fits within the parameters of international law, we might deploy MCDR to help clean up the ocean. Here. The pushback from environmentalists and local communities that has limited or slowed the scale up of renewable energy technologies or terrestrial CDR installations also might be lesser if the process was sited offshore. However, we can't really know that, and the backlash could be much more severe in practice, as Hope will delve into later in this presentation. Lastly, there are a lot of firms already working on the technology and hoping and attempting to generate carbon credits from MCDR deployment. As you would expect, there are a lot of uncertainties and risks at play with MCDR. For one thing, social acceptability, safety, and regulatory frameworks are all serious concerns and gaps in the regime that need to be incorporated into both national and international governance strategies to improve transparency and accountability. I say both national and international because regulation depends on how far offshore a project is cited, and potentially the degree to which developers expect such interventions will have spillover effects that could adversely affect other jurisdictions. MCDR methods are also scarcely incorporated into current climate models, which is a serious gap given the level of MCDR and CDR generally needed to reap the co-benefits and net CO2 reductions in the process of building a regime to manage CDR deployment. When I say socio-technical regimes, I specifically want to draw on the multi-level perspective framework developed by Frank Hales. It helps contextualize the social, cultural, market, policy, and technological features of a system that influence what kinds of niche innovations break through and become part of the system over time. According to this diagram that I've added right here, if you can follow along to it, it's mapping the development of a system over time. And why those technologies tend to break through. In the case, the systems being marine management and carbon mitigation. As I will also link with a QR code at the end of the presentation, I've done some work using this framework on terrestrial CDR. However, what makes it especially interesting in this context is that the landscape is so different for MCDR, given the different parameters imposed by international law and the greater level of technological uncertainty. Mapping it will be key to early stage planning and interventions, as Hope will elaborate on in the next section of this presentation. It's also possible that the level of regulatory and technological uncertainty could help or harm human well-being and ecosystems over time by allowing the system to scale faster while still underregulated. So this uncertainty in regulatory protocols of the regime is something that Hope will go on to relay now, as well as some original work on MCDR research.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, so building on Stephanie's insights on the topic of uncertainty, I'm going to delve more into the specifics. So first is the subtopic of scientific and technological uncertainty. So myself and other members of the Waterloo Climate Intervention Strategies Lab, we recently undertook the writing of a policy brief on MCDR in Canada. And as part of this brief, we gathered MCDR data from 6 leading reports and sources dating between 2022 and 2024. And from these 6 sources, we saw information on key characteristics across 6 MCDR approaches. So namely, we looked at knowledge base, technological readiness level, durability of storage, scalability potential, costs, and environmental risks. And there were 2 interesting findings from the synthesis. The first was that ocean alkalinity enhancement appears to be the most attractive MCDR approach of the 6. It has the in theory, the potential to store CO2 for long periods of time, as well as high scalability potential at an anticipated cost that is similar to others with lower durability and scalability potential. More interestingly, however, was the finding that there is not clear consensus on the key characteristics of technological readiness level, durability, scalability, or costs across 6 sources. While there is consensus that all the MCDR approaches are estimated to have medium to high environmental risks, in acknowledgement of the complexity of ocean ecosystems, it is clear that the current understanding of MCDR is low and that these approaches require significant amount of further research to better understand their characteristics, potential, and effectiveness. And as such, developing and funding a focused research strategy seems to be an important first step. Next slide, please. Only 3 of the 6 sources that we covered address the topic of monitoring, reporting, and verification, or MRV, for MCDR approaches. However, there was consensus among these sources that none of the MCDR approaches will be particularly easy to monitor or verify. And this is due to the indirect pathway of MCDR, where carbon is taken up from the oceans as opposed to directly from the atmosphere, meaning you must account for all the other factors that alter ocean chemistry. Despite this difficulty, MRV will be critical for public confidence and investment in MCDR activity, as well as the orderly integration of MCDR in both national and international carbon pricing mechanisms. Next slide. On the topic of public confidence surrounding MRV for MCDR, there are fundamental outstanding questions supporting public perception and stakeholder engagement practices. Whereas scalability potential in the reports that we covered focused on physical attributes for each technology, social acceptability will also be an important contributing factor to scaling MCDR. One notable example on the importance of public confidence is the April 2023 public protest in the United Kingdom against Planetary Technologies, a Canadian ocean alkalinity enhancement company. With the launch of a field experiment, protesters feared that the chemistry would negatively affect the Bay of St. Ives marine ecosystem and demanded a delay for ocean testing, public consultation, and environmental impact assessment. Planetary's experiment was effectively halted, even upon the release of information that no environmental harm resulted from their experiments. It becomes clear then that any MCDR activity will require public education and outreach, particularly in coastal communities. And furthermore, Indigenous consultation needs to be treated with particular attention given the strong cultural and economic ties that many coastal Indigenous groups have to the ocean. Yet, in the absence of any overarching framework governing public acceptability practices, they have been to date developed on an ad hoc basis at the discretion of companies with little formal oversight. Lastly, there are issues concerning legal uncertainty and complexity for MCDR. Internationally, the focal point of regulation has been the London Protocol to the Convention on the Prevention of Marine Pollution. But currently, the London Protocol regulates ocean nutrient fertilization under a 2013 amendment, effectively restricting it to research activity with no prospect for full-scale deployment. Within the past year, discussion has ensued regarding extending this amendment to include other forms of MCDR, such as ocean alkalinity enhancement, and whether or not this will be the case still remains to be negotiated. A further pragmatic concern is that the London Protocol, under the auspices of the International Maritime Organization, was not designed with MCDR in mind. The challenge here is that the regime is struggling to balance a mandate which focuses on the prevention of ocean depositions with evolving demands to fully explore potential mitigation solutions, even if they entail ocean depositions. Additionally, alongside the London Protocol is a number of other international regimes which may apply to the governance of MCDR. One is the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, with provisions on marine scientific research and environmental protection. There's the Paris Agreement with processes for nationally determined contributions, as well as the recently adopted Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction Agreement with provisions on environmental impact assessment, area-based management tools, capacity building, and technology transfer considerations. And finally, legal considerations also include the mandatory creation and implementation of domestic regimes to parallel and effectuate international rules and processes for MCDR. So as you can see, in totality, there is considerable uncertainty and complexity to unpack and address before MCDR can be deployed with any confidence. So if you scan these QR codes, you'll have access to Stephanie's recent publication on Canadian domestic policy considerations for direct air capture. And you can also find a recent report that I wrote following a webinar series on pathways and perspectives for MCDR in Canada. Finally, our lab's policy brief, which includes the materials that I presented today, will be published soon, and you will be able to find it on our lab website along other resources on climate interventions. Thank you.
Thank you, Hope, and thank you, Stephanie. Again, if there are questions for the presenters, please use the Q&A button section on your screen, and we will come back to them later. Next up is Selina with her presentation. So Selina, I invite you to take the floor.
Wonderful, thank you. Let me share my screen. Remove that. Perfect. Okay, thank you so much, everyone, for being here. Thank you for inviting me. My name is Selina Scott Buechler. I am a JD PhD candidate at Stanford University. And I'll be talking about some work that I've been doing on direct air capture deployment in the US Gulf Coast. So that's primarily Texas and Louisiana, but the area around the Gulf of Mexico. And talking about the potential, but also the conflicts with the possibility of a just transition in this region that is highly reliant economically, but also socially and culturally on the fossil fuel industry. So direct air capture is a technological approach to carbon dioxide removal that typically relies on large fans, though there are other technology configurations to draw air through a filter of some kind to capture CO2 and then to either pump it underground for long-lasting geologic storage or to turn it into long-lived materials. And the Gulf Coast is really quickly becoming what I call the world's direct air capture hub, DAC hub. And this is a play on the US DAC hubs program that was established under the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law in 2021 that set aside $3.5 billion for direct air capture projects in the US. And this was to date and to our knowledge, the largest government investment in direct air capture in the world. And so the US is seeing DAC take off in a way that is enabled by this government support. And the first announcement for funding at the kind of highest level for this program was a direct air capture hub in Texas and Louisiana, an area that was already seeing DAC pop up through private investment. And since the announcement of this DAC hub, a number of other demonstration scale facilities have popped up, both on the capture side, but also in sequestration. And so the Gulf Coast is now shaping up to be not only a place where much of this capture happens, but also even if CO2 is captured in other parts of the country, one of the possibilities is that the Gulf Coast becomes the kind of sequestration site for much of the US's captured CO2. And the law that created this program followed shortly after a presidential executive order 14008 called the Justice 40 Initiative, that aimed to see 40% of the overall benefits of climate and energy projects flowing to disadvantaged communities. And I've italicized this overall benefits here because there's a real question about sort of what benefits this refers to. And environmental justice organizations in particular have called attention to this language and asked for clarity on whether this is 40% of direct investments, how we measure benefits, whether some of the projects that are included under this Justice 40 initiative can actually be seen as benefits. And so the question that motivates this research is whether, Gulf Coast communities view investments in direct air capture in the region as providing benefits, whether direct air capture itself is a benefit or whether there might be ancillary benefits that come along with direct air capture. And so I'm focusing on a mixed methods study that has been completed in the region that drew on 4 parallel focus groups across 3 sites. And this was still sort of prospective. This was back in 2023 when some of these announcements hadn't been made, but there was kind of this swell of interest in the region to try and understand, before there are actually projects in communities, what kinds of benefits, but also what kinds of opportunities and risks might communities envision for themselves were direct air capture to come knocking. And this was then paired with 2 statewide surveys in Texas and Louisiana to try and understand not just sort of perspectives on direct air capture, but the real motivating question was what kinds of benefits and risks might communities see were this to be an option in their communities. Oops, sorry. And so I'll cover the surveys first. There's a lot of rich data in this, and the paper that I apologize for circulating a little late. I'm getting over a flu, but that goes into this a lot more. But the thing that I wanted to call attention to was we asked at the end of learning about direct air capture through this survey, we asked open-ended questions of respondents. What kinds of benefits and risks do you think might be associated with these kinds of projects? And folks had a variety of different answers, obviously, and we qualitatively coded them into these few buckets that we saw as kind of unifying many of the responses. So addressing climate change, improving the environment, economic and jobs benefits, no benefits, and then on kind of the risk side or challenges side, cost of implementation, impact on local resources, that the technology would end up being ineffective or maybe even counterproductive via, for example, greenwashing that enabled continued fossil fuel production, community disenfranchisement or job losses that would actually harm communities, and no concerns. And one of the things that I really want to call attention to here, we didn't frame direct air capture directly in climate change terms. And the reason for that being that climate change is a contentious topic in Texas and Louisiana. And so, we talked about sort of like atmospheric benefits. We did talk about extreme weather, but didn't name climate change directly. And it was really interesting to see that while in focus groups, folks often talked about climate change, even though we sort of, didn't present the climate change frame, that most of the discussion of benefits in these survey open ends were about improving the environment. And some of those were about improving the global environment, but many of these comments were on improving local environments. And this is something that I've seen come up in direct air capture work that I've done myself, but also in others' direct air capture work, that there is this almost automatic, and it's a really tempting assumption that if you're cleaning up a pollutant in the air, a greenhouse gas from the air, that you're also cleaning up other forms of air pollution, that to clean the air of one thing is to clean the air of many things. And so many of these responses talked about better air quality, and what effects that could have on their local environments. This is a misconception, at least in kind of current technological configurations and what we know about them, that direct air capture is able to address CO2, but is not addressing NOx and SOx and PM, the kinds of air pollutants that affect human health and ultimately people's view of the kind of human and natural environment in their communities. And then also kind of telling that sort of the cost of implementation, even if this was initially to be borne by others, by a private entity, by the government, that there were fears, and this was borne out in focus group discussions as well, that ultimately cost of maintaining this new infrastructure would somehow fall to the local community, either through maintenance of, and this is from focus groups, but maintenance of connective infrastructure like roads and energy systems, or through the cost of maintaining the facility itself would fall to their local government, for example. And so, as I mentioned, we conducted focus groups across across 3 sites in Louisiana and Texas. And so these were in Alexandria and Lake Charles, Louisiana, and Port Arthur, Texas. And we asked folks at the beginning, sort of, after a brief presentation, how they felt about direct air capture in their communities, and then also asked this question after the focus group discussions themselves. And the things that I want to call out in this slide are, first, there were quite different sentiments across communities, even within this one area, that were not shown in our coarser resolution statewide surveys. So we asked we asked about one's own perception about what direct air capture in one's community. We also asked about how respondents thought that their communities in general would view direct air capture. And then, because we were trying to look at whether direct air capture could offer just transition opportunities, so opportunities for kind of an economic shift away from extractive and high emissions industries, we also asked about workers in oil and gas. And what we saw, as I mentioned earlier, is very different perspectives across communities. While Alexandria's participants were largely in favor, we saw much more mixed views in Lake Charles. And then the final question from this post survey that I wanted to call out was this question about whether there would be support for projects without guaranteed jobs. One of the things that we saw in the statewide survey, though it wasn't the most commonly raised opportunity, was the potential to produce jobs and economic benefits, and certainly the inclusion of this program under Justice 40 implies, or maybe more than implies, that there will be local economic benefit. And we saw very low levels of support for direct air capture as a technology, as divorced from something that could bring local jobs. And so if those jobs weren't guaranteed, we saw the likelihood of supporting direct air capture going down significantly. And then the final thing that we were able to dig into a bit more in the focus groups, given the setting, was preferences on not only the sort of technology itself, but also technology configurations. And this is something that I think is often overlooked in direct air capture research, is that, direct air capture actually refers to this broad suite of technologies, and views on those technology configurations are likely to determine views of the overall project itself. And so we asked about CO2 storage and transportation mechanisms, the facility developer and owner, the energy and heat source for the facility, and the jobs creation potential of a facility. And we asked, which of these options would you consider acceptable? And so folks could answer that, multiple of these options in each of these groups would be acceptable to them. And one of the things that was really striking to us was this strong preference for utilization of CO2. So rather than pumping it underground, which folks had a hard time kind of understanding as sort of, business chain for its economic reasons, it made a lot more sort of intuitive sense economically that you would take something that is clearly valuable because people are paying to take it out of the atmosphere and turn it into something else that's valuable. So building materials. In addition to it making more intuitive sense, there was a perception that turning it into, something else could allow for greater economic opportunity for the region, but also could contribute really tangibly to local development and infrastructural needs. So if your CO2 that had just been extracted from the atmosphere could be turned into roads or buildings, especially recovering from the increasingly frequent hurricanes and natural disasters that the region sees, that made a lot more sense to folks. And then the
Elena,
other thing—
I'm sorry to interrupt you. I'm just mindful of time.
Yes,
if you could wrap it up for like 1 minute, maybe. Sorry about this. Thank
Absolutely. You. No, thank you so much. I meant to set a timer for myself, and then I got too excited. And then the final thing that I wanted to call out in this slide is the really strong preference for renewable energy as the energy and heat source for a facility, even in a region that is economically and culturally tied to fossil fuels. So thank you so much. Look forward to discussion.
Thank you very much. Thank you to our 3 presenters. Again, also, if you have any questions for Selina or about the presentation, please use the Q&A section. We will now go to our discussants, and we're very excited to have 3 excellent discussants with us that will give some feedbacks and thoughts about the presentations on the topic from 3 different perspectives, roughly about kind of a governance perspective, more of a kind of industry stakeholder perspective, and then also civil society. So I invite Professor Burns to start us off with his thoughts and ideas. Welcome, Will, to our discussion.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. So just some very brief observations on the 3 presentations. First of all, in terms of Sven's and CCS in Italy and Greece, a couple of things that I think are interesting for moving forward on this. One is the question of how you meaningfully and ethically structure public engagement in face of extremely limited information on topics that are really perceived by the public as extremely esoteric and inaccessible in many ways from a scientific and a technological perspective. I think a major question is whether providing small bits of information, which is usually what happens in these cases, whether it's a 10-minute presentation at a public meeting or a one-pager on these, meaningfully provides the kind of information that can allow citizens to make informed decisions and provide any kind of meaningful social license to operate. And it's also a major question as to who provides that information. Is it objective? Does it provide different perspectives in terms of risks and benefits of these approaches? And who should be the pertinent purveyor of that kind of information, I think remains a contested sort of question on these projects as well as most CDR projects. Another thing to note, I think, is that a survey of this sort in terms of CCS attitudes is just a snapshot. It's based on limited information. These kind of attitudes can shift quickly when projects start to be implemented. There's lots of key choke points. We've seen in the United States, for example, that a lot of the resistance to these projects is not in the facilities themselves, but in the pipelines, when one has to convey CO2 for storage. And one of the things that's very clear in the United States, and probably will be true in most of the world, is that most of this CO2, even though, as Selena indicated, there's aspirations by communities for utilization, most of this CO2, probably from an economic perspective, is going to be stored, right? And pipelines are a major choke point of resistance in the United States. It's already scuppered a couple of pipeline projects in the Midwest, even in extremely conservative states where we've seen coalitions of environmentalists and ranchers and farmers resisting these projects on the grounds of safety or the autonomy of their property. And that's likely to be something that we see in some of these areas too. And then the other major choke point away from the project is where the CO2 is stored, right? And perceptions that it may be unsafe, there may be leakage, there may be introduction of CO2 into water tables. And so as these projects develop and become a little more real, we may see these attitudes harden in terms of resistance. So it'll be interesting to see the follow-up research in this context, and we'll see this in a number of places in Europe also, including the new very large-scale $20 billion plus commitment in the United Kingdom to CCS in Teesdale and other areas. In terms of Stephanie and Hope's presentation on MCDR, yeah, there's just a million questions in this context, right? On the one hand, marine carbon removal has an allure because some people perceive that we won't have the same kind of public resistance that we get from terrestrial projects. Also, the marine environment takes up about 40 times more carbon dioxide than than we get on land and from the atmosphere. And so it makes sense to be looking in the oceans. But as they point out, there's a large number of issues to be dealt with. And MRV, one of them that they raise, probably could ultimately be the largest one for a lot of these things, right? When you look at ocean alkalization, for example, as they indicate, one of the problems is that the drawdown from the atmosphere of CO2 comes from this change in equilibration, right? You draw more CO2 out of the ocean, it allows more CO2 to enter from the atmosphere. But that may happen hundreds of miles away from where you have your intervention, which makes it very difficult to sort out all of the factors that may have effectuated that change in equilibration. And it may occur years from when you intervened. And so how do you measure that accurately and translate that, especially in a voluntary carbon market, into units of carbon removal that can be sold and in which the market has confidence that this has actually been effectuated? And that's an issue that may remain bedeviling forever. I think in terms of governance issues, a really important takeaway was the fact that many of these regimes are ill-designed as pollution prevention regimes to deal with interventions that were never contemplated. We're putting more of something into an environment may be salutary. We're struggling with that in the United States. We have something called the Marine Pollution Research of Sanctuaries Act, which implements the London Convention here, and the language of the statute is to always try to minimize the amount of substance you put into the marine environment and to put it on land if possible, right? So it clearly doesn't contemplate that we may be wanting to do some of these things. And how do we create a risk orientation where we acknowledge that there are risks of intervening in this way, but that has to be weighed against the risks of unchecked climate change, right? And the London Convention has struggled with that. For the most part, it has not taken that approach. The European scientific body GAZAMP has now started pushing back on that and pointing out that we really do have to engage in that kind of risk sort of orientation. But the question is, can a regime that is acculturated not to do so shift and facilitate that? And it's unclear. In terms of UNCLOS, one of the things that is interesting from the advisory committee from the International Tribunal of the Law of the Sea is that in one brief paragraph, it did address marine carbon removal, but pretty negatively, right? Emphasizing that under the law of the sea, you're not permitted to address one kind of pollutant by creating another kind of pollutant, right? But again, there's no sense of a risk sort of calculus that may realistically be necessary in an increasingly imperiled world. The other thing that I'd point out is a regime that's emerging under UNCLOS that may be extremely important in the future for MCDR regulation is the Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction Treaty, which is likely to enter force in 2025. Its environmental impact assessment provisions, which are more stringent than UNCLOS's original provisions, may have a significant impact in terms of how MCDR research and potential deployment ensues. And then finally, in terms of Selena's piece, lots of rich things here, right? In some ways, it may be paradoxical to some that we try to help communities that have been negatively impacted by technological interventions in the past by more technological interventions. And it seems like some of these communities believe that is a paradox and maybe one that they don't want to accept. Another thing that I think is interesting is the references to lots of resistance to fossil fuel energy company involvement in direct air capture projects. But the reality, in my opinion, is given their expertise and given their capital, they're likely to ultimately own most of these facilities. Occidental has already purchased, for example, the second largest direct air capture company, and I suspect more of that will happen in the future. And the question is, will that create more backlash to these projects, while at the same time providing the kind of capital and expertise that may be critical to ultimately scale these kinds of projects? And then finally, while utilization seems to be what most people want in terms of CO2, the reality is, from an economics perspective, that utilization is likely to be a very small component of what we do in terms of capturing CO2. Most of it's probably going to have to be stored. Is that going to create more backlash, and what will be the implications for these projects? And so, mindful of time, I will stop with that. And thank you very much for very insightful presentations.
Thank you very much, Will. Thank you for your comments. Hopefully we'll have some time to discuss later on a little bit, but I'll move on and give Elisa Guasti the floor right now, kind of coming in from a more of an experience working with industrial stakeholders in this area.
Hello, good morning, good afternoon, everybody, and start sharing my presentation. Oh, it's not what I wanted to share. Just a second. Maybe now. Do you see in presentation mode?
Yes.
Okay. So my name is Elisa Guasti, and thank you for inviting me here. Now I cannot change the slide. Okay. So I'm a geologist by background and also with PhD in geology, so maybe a different background than most of you. And I've been working several years in industry, and especially in the oil and gas sector, from technical roles into business. And then in the last few years, I moved more into projects, funding, and also working at university. And since last year, I work at the cluster Green Tech in Italy as international project officer. So I bring my expertise from a technical background into more social science, especially in the project where we are involved on CCS projects. A cluster Green Tech, most of you probably do not know what a cluster is, and even less what is a Green Tech. We are a small association based and formed in Emilia-Romagna, which is a region in the north of Italy. You can see it on the map. We are an association of more than 120 members, which are mainly industry members, small, medium-sized companies, but also research centers, innovation centers, training institutions, aiming to help them to work together for supporting competitiveness and innovation in the region. And Emilia-Romagna region is one of the most wealth and industrialized region in Italy, but also in Europe. So large companies and also the hard-to-abate companies are all present in the region. So the whole value chain in large technical projects are based here. And we are embedded in the ecosystem of the region. So we are working together with other clusters on different sectors. We are specialized in energy and environmental development. We work a lot with the policymakers of the region, but also with the other laboratories and the universities and technopoles, big data association. So we are embedded in a very large ecosystems of innovation and stakeholders. We are currently working on two big European projects. One is the Hercules that Sven has just presented. And so I will also share a few slides on that. Also because part of the project is in Emilia-Romagna, so we are much involved in getting the stakeholders engaged and citizen engagement for the region. And also the storage will happen in our region, offshore, so to give us some more information on the project. And we are also involved in another project, which is also in a European funded project on infrastructure, also on CCS. But I will mainly focus on the first one. So one of what we think is a very important part of the project, of a social perception of the project, is to set up a stakeholder committee. So we ask some of our members, but not only our members, but also some of the other industrial parties and policymakers to be part of our committee. And we form one, I mainly talk about the Emilia-Romagna one, but there is also one parallel in Greece, where we aim to, now, first of all, the first top characteristic is the diversity. So we are having in this stakeholder committee local representative of society, industry, politics, and association, and with the objective of meeting at least once per year through the whole project. So we aim to share the results of the project with the stakeholder committee, but also get the feedback from the committee into the project. And this is, so we started this year, just a picture, but we were more. There are about 30 people joining our committee. And we do it in presence, so not online. And we invited people from research, industry, governance, and association. Industry, we not only our members, but because we have this embedding in the region, we have easy access also to other industry, especially all the hard-to-abate present in the region. So we had several of them. But then we also have a researcher working on CCUS topics from universities and from research centers. We also had the people from the region, so from governance and so policymakers, which can also help in when drawing the future policies, and also people from associations. And we also try to get the environmental association. And I think having this group of people working together is really important for the project, to get their feedback and also for them to know more about the project. During the first meeting, we let them work together like in focus group. I present a few pictures of them working together, and we propose them some of the questions on how important is the project, what is their perception on CCUS, what would happen if CCS, if project like Hercules would not happen in the region, but also what are the risks and what are the obstacles, which would be the main actors. So we gave some like a discussion point to work on, and then we still report. And we are planning to do a second meeting next month, and then every year, where we can also present new results of the project, but also to get attention to some of the points which raise in the project and in other study, which may be key point of discussions. part of the project is also citizen engagement, and we are aiming to do different activities in the next years. One is working on focus group, as we saw also in a previous presentation, that can be very important to have a reconvene a focus group from citizens, especially the citizens who are mainly living in the area most affected. And in our case, for us, is the region, is the part of the region, the province where the storage will be. So we are going to organize focus groups there. But we are also going to organize a public conference with interactive activities, so to get more people involved, and also dissemination events. In the region, we have several international conference on environment and on energy. So we are going to organize activities there so we can get more people involved. And these people are more technical people, but they can also bring information on the project outside to the citizens, to the family, parents. So we still think there are really important actors which can help to bring the results to the citizens. And just some conclusive remarks. Maybe I also reply to some comments that Professor Burns has raised on how we want to get people involved, because it's not easy to, we just sometimes with a presentation of 10 minutes, and I completely agree. This is why in this project, in our methodology, we try to apply the different type of activities to different stakeholders, like the stakeholders we are using we have invited in our committee are very important as a middle person from the engineer, from the project into the society. So they are the one who can make policy, and we saw also in Sven's presentation how important it is to get policymakers involved. And also, but we also try to get the citizen and to understand their needs and concerns, also to avoid all the protests, strong protests that we saw also in the other presentation that can happen, and they can really be an issue for the technology.
Elisa, I'm sorry to interrupt, but maybe like 1 or 2 more minutes, and then we need to
finish. It's the
on.
last
okay.
one.
Oh, okay. Thank
So
you.
I finish the sentence, and
yeah.
So yeah, again, the importance, and we agree on the methodology. But we think that the methodology we are applying in our project, as we see also in the previous presentation, and all together can really help to get people involved, and also transparent communication is very important, and especially to give a voice to the stakeholders. That's like a key point, to listen to them. That is my last slide. Thank you.
Thank you. Apologies for interrupting. I wasn't sure if maybe you had like
No,
additional
sorry if I
slides.
was
Thank
too
you.
long.
Thank you. Elizabeth, on civil society, and then we'll move on to a few questions towards the end.
Yeah. Good morning and good afternoon, good evening. It feels a bit like the Truman Show to say that, but I think that's the exciting part, that we have people from all over the world. And I try to keep it condensed, because I'd love to give our audience a chance to get engaged as well. And I think a lot of things have been said already. So maybe not by everyone, not by me, but by most of the others. So I need to find already where I can add on that. And what I wanted to start on is this. I mean, we are talking here about a group of technologies or technological approaches that are, as we also saw in the different presentations, or that were also pointed out, for example, by Bill Burns, that are unknown to many. And this unknown concerns the public, but it often also concerns policymakers, local stakeholders like mayors, people from associations, from industry, etc. And still, I'd say, even I've been now in this field for 15 years, little discussed or only discussed among those who know about it. And they are pushed by certain industries, for example, the fossil fuel industry, which does not always help to make a discussion or an open discussion easier. And at the same time, from those more engaged with the technological side, we do know we need their expertise and their competences. Otherwise, if we as a society want to implement these technologies, which might, I think this was quite clear in the second presentations, we have quite different levels of technological readiness, etc. So yeah, implementation is nowhere to happen on a large scale tomorrow, but even if you want to prepare for it. So the good thing is, kind of, in a way, we have time now to, while the technological progress goes forward, to have these discussions, but we really have to start them now. And commenting on this from a perspective of a project perspective, like the Hercules project, where we are also supporting, and which was very nicely presented and outlaid by Elisa, you've seen there are some things you can do as a project or as a social scientist, political scientist, as we saw in the third presentation. Like, you can engage in focus groups, or as Sven presented, we can do surveys which give a snapshot, but then we have a more detailed snapshot, or engage with the people. And I think this report about the focus group very nicely showed that providing information helps to shape opinions, but what direction these opinions are going to take, and I assume you've given very similar information in all of these groups, but then the group dynamics come in, and then the outcome is quite a variety. So information is obviously not going to kind of make us all wiser and come to the right decision, because it's related to a lot of other aspects. And then when it's about implementation, we have a lot of factors: the local context, the historic context, what people think about the industries itself. But then the big thing is also the framework around that. What do the government of the state, or in Germany, we also have states, and in other countries, so we have then the national government, we have international negotiations, and many of that, it's not under control of people locally developing projects. So I think that's one important thing to acknowledge. And another thing, just kind of small addition, an experience that we've made supporting projects with research mainly, is that it's also very important that even within the group of those involved in the projects, there's internal discussion, because usually we see that while we think that we're all working towards the same goal, that we have quite different understandings of what the role of the technology should be, what are acceptable conditions, who should pay, and all of these things, so that it's quite worthwhile to already start on this tiny level to interact and discuss and move forward. And so now we have at least 7 minutes left.
Thank you. Vanessa, I'll give you the floor for the Q&A, and also the session wrap up when it's time.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much, Anne. And so we have only a few minutes, and I did see that there was a question that was posted in the Q&A where Selena provided a written answer, but I suppose I will see if there's any further posts that have been put forward by attendees.
And maybe, I think there was an option to make the attendees also discussion panelists, so we can interact if that's still possible. I think that would be great, asking kind of to our host.
Yeah, and I believe that perhaps in order for us to know that you're interested in verbally asking your question, it helps if you use the raise hand button. And perhaps while people are waiting to collect their thoughts, I suppose a question that I could pose where if anybody does decide to jump in, I guess I would ask you to give a very brief answer. See if you could try to limit yourself to one sentence so we could try to get as many responses as possible. In light of the fact that we're talking about these very novel technologies and we're sort of in that learning by doing phase, do you have sort of a one sentence recommendation for best practices so that we perhaps in our pragmatic projects can get as close as possible to achieving the ideals that we have, right, for these novel technologies and how they might help us with the climate change problem? So yeah, like maybe any like immediate thoughts, maybe in terms of recommendations for implementation. Would you simply echo that some of the practices you've seen people show here, we should just keep doing them, or are there further innovations that we should bear in mind?
So I just start to give it a go. I think it's very important to be flexible and reflective and to look into the local conditions. So don't expect that there's a standard campaign that you kind of run and then it's going to work, but to be very conscious of this.
And maybe to add on to that, not just sort of, retooling educational campaigns, but also being open as these are new technologies to shaping the technologies themselves around local needs is I think a really exciting thing that this field has the opportunity to do.
And maybe to have the chance to be flexible, you need to start early and not engage in the last step where you just have the option to, not continue it or discontinue it and stop. So it's better to do it early on to be able to react.
I think we need interdisciplinary communities of practice to be established, because negotiations and discussions, deliberations, they're all happening on an ad hoc basis right now. So to have kind of like an established community of people, scientists, industry, academics, social scientists, to be able to have them in a sustained, like engaged conversation is going to be important.
Yeah, and oh, Will, you're muted.
I think it'd be helpful to have more structured sort of public engagement in some of these contexts, things like citizen juries, for example, that convene over the course of a number of days to try to tease out some of the risk sort of trade-offs that we talked about. And ultimately, those kind of deliberations can diffuse knowledge into the communities themselves and help overall with the social license to operate calculus. And I don't think we do that much. It's expensive, it's dirty, but it's probably the ethically the best approach.
Maybe if I can add one last thing, I think being open and transparent about objectives, kind of, because I agree with Selina, your point of kind of interdisciplinary kind of practices, but then again, also what Elisabeth was saying, I think we need to talk about kind of what is actually the goal kind of each of the stakeholders or involved parties is actually pursuing with this, and kind of have communication about this and be open and transparent about this.
And I wasn't sure, Stephanie, if you were about to say something as well.
I think, I mean, I could add things. I think based on our research together, I work with Vanessa. We're also out of the Watts is a lab I mentioned earlier in the presentation. Is to have these like forward-thinking practices that incorporate interdisciplinary perspectives. So scenario planning that uses these kinds of qualitative inputs that we get from, participant engagement or public engagement kinds of studies, as well as expert elicitation. And perhaps as a side note, also not devaluing necessarily, I think as Selina's presentation helped to illuminate, not devaluing local perspectives as like lesser in any way than experts, because they have their own kind of unique expertise that can contribute in interesting ways to potentially shape technologies, which is something that I think I'll be thinking more about as well.
Yeah, and since we're basically in the final minute of our session, I definitely want to thank everyone for tuning in, and certainly, you know, if you have further thoughts about anything that you saw in this webinar, be sure to take a look at our page for this particular event. There are bios for all of the speakers, also ways to contact them to follow up and ask further questions about their research or about the work that they do in this space around carbon dioxide removal, doing projects, and trying to, once again, achieve our ideal goals through this pragmatic work of getting more familiar with the technology and figuring out how to deploy it. So thank you once again for joining us today.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thanks.